Welcome to today's Pharmatech and ESP webinar, Cost Savings Related to Qualifying Cell and Gene Therapies Facilities. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us. Next slide. Each registration is unique and grants the right for the individual registrant only to view this webinar. Sharing this webinar with unregistered viewers, either during or after its performance, violates USP's copyright and is prohibited. Next. If you have not already done so, we ask that you take some time to read the USP Education course disclaimer. You can download this presentation, including the disclaimer, from your USP Education account. Please follow the instructions in your confirmation email to download the presentation. Next. Presenting today is Moria Feighery-Ross, Senior Consultant, Pharmatech Associates. Welcome and thank you to Moria. I will now turn the presentation over to you.
Good morning or good afternoon, as the case may be. I am, as she said, I'm Moria Feighery-Ross. Been with Pharmatech for quite some time now. I love what I do, and I hope that you will enjoy what I have to say about this. So what we're going to talk about today is really in three phases. When you're qualifying a cell and gene therapy facility, the place you really start is how you're making the facility in the first place, or the things you have selected in the way that you've chosen to do to build your facility and to get to where you need to be from where you are. So we'll talk first about the capital costs. We'll talk about facility design, construction, and the equipment you select and buy. Next up, we will talk about actual CQV, the commissioning, qualification, and validation that goes on within your facility. Following that, we're going to talk just a little bit about ongoing operational costs. All of these things, of course, go into how much you're going to wind up paying to have this facility and to move forward with it. Basically, the way that we save in any given situation, at home or at work, is that you can save by not spending money. This part's simple. You know what you need. Don't buy more than you need. Don't spend on complexity. Don't spend on a lot of different things within your facility if you don't need it. Don't spend on capacity that isn't needed. For us in cell and gene therapy, especially if we're all pretty much doing autologous, if you have, there's only one, as far as I recall, allogenic approved therapy, although some of you may well be in that building up towards approval. But cell and gene therapy tends to be very small batch sizes, so you don't want to spend on a huge facility or a large amount of big equipment if you're not going to need that. Also, as you're doing this, be phase appropriate. You may not need to spend money on a lot of equipment, a lot of qualification, a lot of operation if you're in early phase and you're just building up. The other way you save money is to spend it. You choose where you spend and what you spend on. Ultimately, this can save you in the long run. And so the main topics I really want to talk about is project management, and also how far in the future you look. First, as always, and as everything in this industry, we will talk about risk assessment. Risk assessment is not optional, is never optional. You can do it formally, or you can also do it informally. When we perform risk assessment constantly every single day. Humans are made for risk assessment. As a brief example, you're at the grocery store and you suddenly realize you may need to buy bananas, but you're not sure, right? You go ahead and make that risk assessment right in your head. The risk of not buying them is not having them if you need them. The risk of buying them is you already have them and that you're going to have way too many. You could go from what I've just said into an entire formal risk assessment about buying bananas. But the key point in our industry is to bring risk assessment to a level of consciousness where you're aware that you're doing it, and that you discuss it, and that it's core to how you discuss your decisions at work. You perform risk assessment pretty much for everything that you're choosing to do within your facility. When you're choosing what kind of environmental quality you need, choosing what equipment, when you're choosing how to store, how to distribute your product. It goes on. We do risk assessment all the time, as I said, but it can be formal or informal. So first up, construction and capital costs. There are a definite few things that you can consider when you're considering building this facility and what you're going to put in it. The first thing you want to do is plan and set your expectations. Next up, project management. These are topics I'm going to go through in the next few slides. The decisions you make about environmental quality, about HVAC and other utilities that you're going to build into your facility. You have decisions to make about how you go about ensuring that your product is pure and not sterile, because most of these products are living-based. Many of these products are living-based cells. And we're going to talk about this, the economies of scale. As you're going forward, what do you need to do to make enough product for what you're trying, where you're at within the phase of your product life cycle. Okay, if we're going to plan, we're going to set some expectations. How long do you think this project is going to take? This construction, facility construction or renovation? Double it. I'm not kidding. If you did this in 2017 and you know how long it took you then, forget all of that. Things have changed dramatically in the past 5 years for reasons that are obvious to all of us. Lead times have increased dramatically across the board. We're out a year for some HVAC components. We can be out a year for even some for equipment. So what you need to do in order to make sure that your project comes in on time first is to decide what on time is, but then to have backup plans. I've been recently in a project where the team decided, because one equipment vendor couldn't provide until December, that they were going to fall back on the other equipment that they had been deciding that was part of their decision process, because that vendor could provide it more quickly. You want to have a backup plan, and maybe even a backup to your backup. Also, we're going to get into this in the next couple slides. Really sit down and consider what your actual process needs. So I talked about spend to save just briefly. This is where this comes in. You want experienced designers to design your facility. It seems like it's intuitive, but it doesn't always wind up working out that way in practice. You need to do what you can to ensure that this is part of it. Even more, you want a really good capital project manager. You want someone whose entire job is to manage your project, not your facilities guy, maybe, who knows what the facility should be, but maybe doesn't have experience chasing down submittals, chasing down invoices, all of that. You need somebody to do this for you, or you will lose money and spend extra time. So what you're seeing here is a good way to lose money and spend extra time is to design your facility yourself. This, you wind up, and I've seen this many times in projects, you wind up doing redesigns midway through. And you wind up deciding, oh, I didn't need this, and whoops, I need my pressure cascade to go this way instead of that way. A great way to lose money and spend extra time is not to have an experienced PM whose sole job is your project. If you don't have somebody to chase down contractors, if you don't have somebody to review all those submittals, if you don't have somebody to chase down invoices, your project is going to take longer and you're going to spend more money doing it. So in this case, you really want to make sure that you're investing in experienced design and that you're investing in a really good project manager to help you through this process. Hey, have we talked about risk assessment yet? I want to talk about risk assessment a little bit more. You have to decide what environmental quality you need. Do you need an air handling unit that's going to provide? Do you need an entire ISO 5 suite? Do you need ISO 7? Are you going to do biosafety lab? Are you going to have biosafety lab levels, BSL2 or BSL1, depending what you're working with? And also, how much do you need of certain utilities? You need purified water, you need processed gas, but how much of it do you need? You can choose to do these in bottles, or you can choose to put in an entire utility skid. That decision will cost you upfront, will cost you in operation. It depends what you need. You decide where to put that cost. Equipment selection. This is coming in more and more, especially in cell and gene therapy, we're using single-use technology. If you have single-use tech and you put it in an isolator, the glove box, you may not need incubators, parts washers, right? The single use is sterile when you get it. And if you're doing all of any open processing you might have, if you're doing it within an isolator, there's a lot of things that you don't need to think about in terms of equipment cleaning. Okay, economies of scale. If you're in a construction project, you're in the process of scaling up. Essentially, you're going from R&D into early phase clinical studies. Maybe you have early phase clinical done and you are trying to expand your capacity to go forward with more clinical studies. In some cases, we can scale out rather than scale up. It can be a lot easier simply to buy more of a certain kind of equipment rather than trying to buy a larger version of the equipment you're using, because tech transfer and scaling up is not easy. It takes a lot of time and it can take a lot of money. So consider whether you could scale out instead of up. And this is something we may actually talk about a little bit more in the next couple of slides. Consider, if you have to have considered this quite a long time ago if we're at this point, but consider a CDMO. Do you actually want to spend money to build yourself a facility? This is a big question that an entire presentation could be spent on, and I'm not going to do that. But one thing that can be considered is to use a CDMO rather than giving yourself an entire facility that you then have to maintain and have ongoing costs. Another way to do economies of scale is to consider modular clean rooms. You have a large warehouse type building. You can put in one modular clean room, and then as you move forward into scaling up, you can add modular clean rooms rather than having built an entire 18,000 square foot clean room facility. So moving on from the construction of your facility, now we're getting into the point where we can start commissioning and qualifying the utilities and the facility systems. As part of this, we're going to talk about determining what to commission and what to qualify. And then after that, we're going to talk about your equipment and what it's going to take to go through qualification, commissioning and qualification. Have we talked about risk assessment yet? I think we should talk about risk assessment. And what this does is this allows you to choose what you need to commission and what you need to qualify. And you can choose that whenever you want, but in order to actually justify your decision, you have to have risk assessment for it. You can, if you do your risk assessment and you say, well, I have processed gases, I need an entire system because I'm using enough of that. Remember, we talked about that a few slides ago. I do have a processed gas system. If I put final filters on that, 2 micron or 1 micron final filters, and we have routine monitoring of the quality of the gas that's coming out after that filter, you may be able to commission that system only. If you designate your HEPA filters as part of your room, then the quality of the air within that room is defined only by that room system. So you may be able to commission only your HVAC. If you do that, you have routine monitoring, you say my HEPA filters are part of the room, it is possible to only commission your HVAC. This is a thing you will have to have done risk assessment on so that you can justify the decision when someone asks you about it later, and they will. So then we go from commissioning to qualification. We always qualify the equipment that protects the process. This is not negotiable. Does the system have direct product contact? Hey, wait, didn't I talk about utility gas systems on the commissioning only side? That's your risk assessment. If you assess your risk of that product contact, if we're bubbling oxygen and CO2 through a bioreactor, you may need to do something different with that compared to using the gas in a way that doesn't contact the product quite as much. Here's one right out of GAMP in risk assessment. Does the system establish a proper environment, create or maintain a condition necessary to preserve product quality? You cannot skimp on the qualification of these things. but you may be able to do less on some other things. We should assess the risk on that before we move on. Okay, so we're considering, in order to save money, one of the things you do is you consider what equipment you're buying. You consider how your process is going to be performed. If your process isn't set, we work with a lot of clients who are going from R&D right into early clinical phases. So they know what they're doing. The R&D scientists know what they're doing, but their process, your clinical production process, is not set. If that's true, you don't have user requirements because the users don't quite know what the process is going to be. So your R&D people, your development people, your process engineers are going to fall back on getting the equipment they're most familiar with because they know how it operates, they know what it'll do. That's not a bad thing to do that. It just makes writing the URS really difficult because you can't put process parameters in there. So to ease that challenge, and this is something risk-wise, you have to buy into this with your whole chest. You say to yourself, if my user's requirement is that they want this machine, then we have to trust the machine to be doing the things the user requires it to do. And then we simply prove to ourselves that the machine is doing what it purports to do. It's a little convoluted. I'm going to say that one more time. My user, my process scientist, tells me they want this machine. Then what I have to do is say, well, they know what they need. They want this machine, right? Then what you do is you look to what the manufacturer says that machine's going to do, and you make sure you verify, you qualify that the machine actually does those things. Pull the critical GMP functionality out of that, the manufacturer's spec sheet, and call that the user requirement specification. Consider automated systems. So we have automated systems, and simple is not the right word, but we have things like a CPAC cell washer. We have Miltenyi Prodigy. These are things that perform a portion of your process without somebody actually moving things around. You let the machine do that, and you are going to save a little bit on your operational costs because you don't quite need as many full-time employees to pay the ongoing costs of. So we just talked about CPACs and Prodigy and other such things. There are some really exciting things coming out that are more complex than that and automate your entire process. Consider these modular solutions. Scaling up, as I mentioned earlier, is difficult and it takes time. So if you can instead scale out by simply buying more units, right? I shouldn't say all, most of the things we're doing in cell and gene therapy are very small batch sizes, since we're mostly autologous, right? We're getting something from one patient, we're doing something to it, then we're sending it back to that same patient. This happens on a very small scale. So it's really easy for us in cell and gene therapy to do this simply with more equipment rather than trying to do the entire scaling up process and finding out that this larger volume behaves differently than the smaller volume. All of this having been said, when you're choosing equipment and when you're letting your R&D scientists tell you what they need, as a quality person and as someone who has done risk assessment, one of the risks that you consider is data integrity. A lot of the lab equipment doesn't have full 21 CFR Part 11 compliance and doesn't comply with some of the rules for data integrity that we require. There is no phase appropriate for data integrity. Once you're into any kind of trials at all whatsoever, all of that data is going to go into your submission. So you have to ensure from the very start that you have data integrity. So there's a place that you're going to need to spend a little extra money. This lab equipment, if you don't buy the Part 11 package, which is usually what they call it, you're not going to have the data integrity. You're not going to be able to assure the integrity of the data that you need. So in that case, you need to spend the extra on the data integrity, because if you don't now, you're going to wind up doing it later as you scale up more or as you scale forward more into clinical trials. And that's going to cost you at that time. And it may cost you quite a lot if you wind up needing to submit data that you can't prove the integrity of. And you're not going to do that because we don't do that. That's a risk, and it's a bigger risk than any of us are willing to take on. When you have chosen your equipment, then if you're in the early phase of your process, remember, you don't have your entire process parameters. You know what you need to do, but maybe that process isn't fully settled. So you can't give your validation qualification people a very specific list of what they need to be looking at because you don't know. So like I talked about earlier, your user just knows they want that system. So what you can do to make this easier on yourself, and also in some cases to save money, is to lean on the vendors for qualification protocols. And you can consider vendor execution as well. You merely need to supplement a vendor protocol with things that are very specific to your company, to your operation, and your quality systems. You can even consider the vendor execution. In some cases, it's required. I'm working with a really complex and automated cryogenic freezer. I, as a very experienced validation person, couldn't go to that equipment and qualify it to what I would consider to be the correct standard. This one, you have to bring in the vendor, and they'll qualify it, and they're going to help you set it up for what you need. What you don't want to do is hand me a system like that and tell me to qualify it, because it's going to take me a very long time sitting with the system and learning and understanding how it is in order to generate a protocol that will be sufficient to qualify that equipment. So you lean on vendors for protocols, and you may lean on them for execution. It seems, when you look at the cost of doing that by itself, it seems like it might be a lot. But then if you then consider what it would cost for me to do it, or for, you know, an outside contractor, or for your own for your own validation department, you may wind up spending less if you ask the vendor to do that. Okay, so as we're going through your ongoing operation, here's a place where you can really save money. This is the qualification and the ongoing operation of your system, your facility. Have we talked about risk assessment yet? I think we should talk about risk assessment. At this point, you're not in ongoing operation. You may not be in ongoing operation yet. You're still considering your facility. You're considering how to do cost savings. You're considering what you're going to implement that's going to work for your process and that's going to support you moving forward. So one of the biggest ways to save money using risk assessment is to decide what environmental quality you need. If you're using isolators for the only open processing in your, if you are using an isolator to do the only open processing, to load materials into a cassette or a cartridge, for example, that's going to then be put into an automated system, and that cassette and cartridge are single use, you may not need an ISO 5 clean room. Most of us don't need an ISO 5 clean room, because that standard, that quality of air is provided within the isolator, and you don't have any open processing in the room. So at that point, you've used risk assessment, and you say to yourself, well, the risk of product contamination is very low because the only open processing is performed within an isolator. So you may not need an ISO 5 clean room. You may not even need an ISO 7 clean room. If, for instance, you get a modular system that you might call factory in a box. These are just starting to really come into the world, and it's very exciting to see. You load your materials into a cassette or a cartridge on one side, pop that in the system, single use, the system itself contains the environment that you need. This is something you could then drop into a warehouse. If you're using systems like that, you don't have to spend as much on HVAC. You don't have to spend as much on HEPA filtering, air changes, designing your facility such that it maintains an extremely high level of environmental quality, because frankly, you won't need the highest level of environmental quality if you're not doing open processing in any of your rooms. So you have to consider, or you don't have to consider as much, the, say, pressure cascades. You have to consider it, but you may not need to be as strict about it. For the same, in your ongoing operation, if you have all of that closed processing we just talked about, your cleaning procedures and your cleaning frequencies may not need to be as stringent. If you have assessed the risk of your environmental air to be low, medium to low, your cleaning procedure is going to be a lot different than if you're operating an ISO 5 clean suite. You again, hey, let's talk about risk assessment some more. You use risk assessment to develop appropriate monitoring locations and frequency. And this, you can say to yourself, I have this isolator. We're talking about this. I have this isolator. I may not need to do surface sampling in 20 places within my room if I'm using an isolator, because there is no contact. The risk is very low. Look at that big empty space. What have I done? I've made myself a great big clean facility, and then I get stalled in my early phase clinical. When I started this, I was thinking, man, this product is going to take off. We're going to do great in our clinical trials. We've had really good success so far in vitro. We're like real confident that this product is going to do it for us. And we're going to build all the way to think about capacity all the way up to late phase clinical trials or into commercial. Do you really need to think that far ahead? You want to consider the future. You definitely, there's no way you can't, because that's part of risk assessment too. In cell and gene therapy in the early phases, you might in the back of your mind could be considering that you're going to get bought, that your company is going to get bought by somebody bigger, or that you're going to be able to sell this facility or lease out part of this facility later. How confident are you that that's really going to happen? You love to say to yourself, yes, my product is the one. But in reality, there's a lot of people out there saying that, and only some of them are right. One of the strategies that I've seen people employ is that they'll build a facility that can have phased operation. They have several clean suites. They use one of them for R&D. They have one that's actually dark, that they're not doing anything in. That has its own costs. And they have one suite that they're actually doing this clinical production in. So you put a little bit of the cost up front in building all of this, but you have chosen to have a facility that you can use for other things. You can use for non-GMP research. Again, are you really sure that you need full process utility systems? Do you really need an RODI skid that makes 200 gallons a day? That's probably going to be way too much for what you're doing. You can maybe consider getting purified water in bottles. Most of us in cell and gene therapy are very, very small scale. So you may not need an entire skid. You can bring in bottles. This is the same for compressed gases. It's the same for CO2. It's the same for nitrogen. Compressed air, clean compressed air, maybe a little different. Most facilities like to have a skid for that. It's very simple. An unused gas system, if you build these systems and then you wind up not using them, you can shut them down and just let them sit there and be themselves and not do the routine monitoring that you would need to do if you were using them. You can just shut her down, get some little bottles of gas and use those for now. However, if you put in an RODI system, you can't shut that down and restart it without a whole lot of effort, without drastic amounts of effort and money to do that, because you have to be able to assure the cleanliness of that water. And when you stop a water system, as most of us or all of us know, bad things happen. You're going to get all kinds of funny little things growing in the corners. So consider that out front. Do I really need a giant ROGI skid, or can I start out using bottles and maybe put a skid in later? So you can design for phased operation. You can say, well, right now we need this much of process gases and we only need this much water. So we can decide to put in a system and shut it down and not qualify it. You can decide with the process gas system to qualify it and then not use it. Can't do that with water, like I said. You can't decide to run your HVAC system. You can't decide to run your HVAC system differently. It's on or it's off. You can decide that you're not going to use a room and not do routine environmental monitoring and not do routine cleaning. But ultimately, you're paying for the space. And you want that space to pay rent, as it were, right? You're paying for this entire facility, even if you're not using parts of it. Unused idle capacity is a killer for your budget. Unused personnel is a killer for your budget. Be very, very clear with yourself and be very clear-eyed about where your product is, where you want it to go, and where in the real world it's possible it might go or might not. You don't want to pay for idle capacity. So I'm going to spend a lot of time on this conclusion slide because hey, have we talked about risk assessment? I think we should talk about risk assessment. Honest risk assessment, and outright on the table, we are talking about risk. We are talking about what we really need. We are talking about what we really think we're going to go for in the future. So you need to know what you do need. What do I really need to spend money on? We talked about this at the beginning. You do need a capital project manager when you're building a facility. You do need the amount of cleanliness in your environment that protects your product. You don't need your poor facility director to be the one that's managing your project, because he's got other things to do. She's got other things to do. You need a project manager. You need a project manager. You don't need to put that on someone else, no matter how much experience they have with facility projects. A capital project manager, I have done projects with both, and I'm here to tell you that the ones that have a good project manager take half the time. I have worked with facilities where one of the heads of the company, one of the people says to themselves, well, I know what a facility needs. I've done this before. I've been doing this for 20 years. I know what we need to do in our facility, what kind of air changes, what kind of environmental quality. But if your experience is measured from 20 years ago, there's a whole lot of things that have happened since then where you no longer need to consider this major highest environmental quality. We talked about this. You say, wait, I've got isolators. I've been in projects where the person that designed the facility, their experience came from way back and their experience is long and varied. But even those people don't always consider, oh, wait, am I going to wind up marketing this product in Europe? It's an entirely different set of requirements. Maybe that person didn't think of it because they've never actually worked with a product that went international. I have been in projects where they wound up having to, oops, we need twice the air handler than what we've got. We didn't think about that we need this many air changes within our rooms, and oops, now we need to double the air handler capacity. And from that, oh wait, now we have to shore up the roof. Oh, we need different ducting. I have seen this happen in the middle of a project. Imagine how much money that costs compared to if you have an experienced facility design team. If you've hired people who design facilities all the time, they have the long experience, but their experience is current, up to date right now. So in this, you're knowing what you do need. You need this level of environmental quality. You need this size of facility, this capacity, this many items of equipment. You don't need to plan for late phase clinical. You don't need a facility that has the capacity for late phase clinical if you're not there yet. We always want to look to the future. We always want to be optimistic about where we're going. I believe in this product and I know that we're going to do well with it. Take that belief, put it on a shelf and look at it every day. And then look with clear eyes at how far in the future that might actually be. What's going to be between now and then? Is there a potential that the product is maybe not going to do as well in clinical trials as you thought it would? Is there the potential to get bought out? Is there the potential to spend so much on your capital project that you run out of VC, that you run out of venture capital and nobody really wants to give you any more? Then you're stuck, right? Pay attention to your beliefs. What belief is in the background of your mind when you're designing your facility, when you're operating your facility? We don't like to talk about your company maybe getting acquired. Some of us do like to talk about that, but some of us think that we're going to make it all the way to the top. Optimism is lovely. Set it on the shelf and make your decision based on what the real world actually shows you. So one of the ways, as we talked about, is making your commissioning and qualification phase appropriate. You don't want to commission and qualify for late phase clinical or commercial when you're just moving into phase 2, right? That's not phase appropriate. Another thing that's phase appropriate is the intensity of your qualification and commissioning. Be phase appropriate. You may not need to go full ham on IQ, OQ, and PQ on systems that are going to be used for where you don't know your full process. You may reel that back. You know your equipment has this capacity over here, but you don't need to use it right now. You don't need to spend 3 weeks qualifying it. For the moment, you can say, let the vendor do this. We'll make sure the equipment works and we'll move forward with our product so that we can get into the point where we need full late phase clinical production. So they were being phase appropriate in our choices for how we qualify our systems. We consider modular operations, right? If you can get a factory in a box and you can work with that and get through your early phase clinical, you may not need to do scale up, scale out. Be modular. Get a modular clean room, small one, and put it in that warehouse space rather than making that entire warehouse space into a clean suite. Excuse me. So what we really need to do is make honest assessments of where you are, where you want to be, and where you probably are going to be. You consider this. Assess your risk with clear eyes. Put everything on the table when you're talking about this. These risk assessments are what's going to save you the most money when you're doing capital projects, when you're building, when you're doing CQV, and when you're doing your ongoing operations. Assess your risk. Think about it. Think carefully about it. That's what's really going to save your costs. Those are your considerations. That consideration, that one thing above everything else, is what's going to save you money when you're approaching commissioning qualification of a cell and gene therapy facility. At this time, I do want to start addressing some questions. But before that, I invite any of you to contact me with questions. I invite you to reach out on LinkedIn. I love talking about this stuff, and I would love to talk to you about it. At this point, we're using Conferences.io to submit our questions, and we're going to look at those and see which questions are most exciting to all of you, which ones you have upvoted. Oh, friends, nobody has any questions? Well, all right, I'll dip back into a little bit more detail about our selection process and our capital projects process. Um, there are a very lot of ways to save money during your capital projects. There are a very lot of ways to spend money in your capital. So in all of the capital projects that I've done, in all of the CQV projects that I've done, the best way for it to not go well is to not have a good project manager. Um, what you need is that person who has the schedule, has the end goal in mind at all times. You don't need your facilities director to do this. You don't need your head of, gosh, you really don't need your head of QA to be doing this. You need the input of all of those people to make your decisions clearly and to assess your risk clearly. But your biggest risk for spending money in a construction and capital project is going to be not running the project correctly. It's not going to be the equipment you buy. It's not going to be the equipment that you qualify. Your biggest risk, again, is project management. I am not able to see, Christy, I am not able to see that question because of the little orange bar. Let me see if I can drag it. Nope. Do you need to segregate entries, exits for people, material, and waste? You absolutely do, for the most part. Have we talked about risk assessment? Let's talk about risk assessment some more. So if you know to yourself that you're going to be using EU standards, if you know to yourself that you're going to be doing ISO and not EU, if you know to yourself that you're going to go into Asia, other places, all of those countries, all of those regulatory bodies have different requirements. So we are looking with risk assessment about, that's a question, do we need that? Do we need a production suite that very obviously has an entry airlock and an exit airlock? If you've got those isolators and you've decided that you don't need an ISO 5 clean suite, that you don't need even an ISO 7 clean suite, you've got a fully enclosed automated process. No, you don't. You can have a regular clean room that has gown in and out in the same room. Although at least for form's sake, you probably want to have a line down the middle because we all know that dirt doesn't cross those lines. But you may not actually need to segregate personnel movement into and out of supply and return. And so that's part of your risk assessment. Do you need backup power supplies? Now, that's a whole different risk. My easy answer, yeah, you do. There are certain processes, certain types of equipment, some of the PCR systems. If that system loses power, the run is interrupted and cannot be restarted. If you lose power to the temperature control functionality of your equipment, of your facility, you're not going to be able to assure that that happens at the right temperature no matter what. Yes, you need a backup power supply. Now, part of your consideration of risk is how likely is it that you're going to have a utility power failure? How likely is it that that utility power failure is going to last more than a couple of hours? You may only need to put in battery backup, uninterruptible power supply. If there's any possibility that your power failure is going to be longer than maybe an hour, and frankly, that's true for most of us, maybe you need to get a backup, you need to get a diesel generator. But you still need the UPS because the generator, there is no generator that's going to start up soon enough for that PCR machine to be able to continue its process. There's no backup generator that can start soon enough for you to really feel good about the temperature within your incubator or within the very small processes that we're doing. Smaller process doesn't have the heat capacity. It's a great big block of ice is going to stay a block of ice, but a smaller, a tiny little ice cube, boom, it's gone. As soon as cold is gone from it, as soon as heat hits it, that's going to be gone. So as part of your risk assessment, you're considering the heat capacity of the materials that you're storing. I would be very surprised if you don't need at least an uninterruptible power supply. I would be somewhat surprised if you don't need a diesel generator. If you really trust your power grid, good for you. A lot of us here, I'm in California, for instance, we can't trust our power grid in some places because of the risk of wildfire. So we are all considering that risk. Your risk is different than mine. If you're in Arizona, your risk is different than mine. If you're in Boston, your risk is different than mine. If you're in Manchester, England, right? This is part of that risk assessment, part of that clear-eyed risk assessment. What is our actual risk? What air cleanliness standard, I'm going to move on to this next question. What air cleanliness standard is required for the area surrounding a biosafety cabinet? It's a good question. And one of the things, one of the ways that you can approach that question is to look at the vendor spec. The vendor will tell you what kind of air, what the quality of air supplied to it needs to be. Biosafety cabinets have their own air filtration systems. So it may be possible to start with ISO 8. It may be necessary to start with ISO 7. That is also going to be part of the risk assessment. Hey, wait, have we talked about risk assessment? That's part of the risk assessment for the BSc. What are you doing within it? All of all of these questions are answered when you do risk assessment. When you read, in the case of a BSc, when you read the manufacturer specifications, the manufacturer tells you that you don't need ISO 7 air, that you just need room air that's filtered. Then what you do is you qualify to that. You're gonna make sure, you're gonna make very sure when you do your qualification that you get the cleanliness of air inside that BSc that you need. You get it certified, and then you go in there and you do media fills, you do process simulation and make sure. So first you've assessed the risk, and then you're testing whether your assessment is correct. If there are, oh, there is another question. I love this. So what's the risk when you manufacture multiple products in the same clean room? Well, there are different kinds of risk associated with that. The first one, probably the most important one, is cross-contamination. It's not just about the air touching the product. It's about whether someone carrying in process from here to here might accidentally turn left instead of turn right, or go to the wrong bench. There is a risk of that. There are different ways to mitigate that risk. If you arrange your equipment such that the entire process happens in one row of benches, and you have a next row over there ahead of it, you have a third row after that, you have done a certain amount of mitigation to prevent make it less likely that that product, as it goes from step to step in your process, the risk is lower if you design that part of the facility correctly. If you are using a factory in a box, and you have really several factories in a box in the same clean room, the risk of cross-contamination is very low. And the risk of your product going in process from this bench to the wrong next bench is gone. You don't have that risk anymore. When your process steps, several or all of your process steps are automated into one item of equipment, the risk of that is gone. There's not a possibility that one of your operators is going to carry your in-process product somewhere else. The other part of the risk of manufacturing multiple products in the same clean room, of course, is the air quality, not the people, not the risk of people cross-contaminating, but the risk of simply the air, of simply the environment giving you cross-contamination. That also is assessed based on how your process is performed. If you've got isolators and there's no open processing in the room, the risk of air cross-contamination, environmental cross-contamination, environmental contamination in general is very low. So to choose, and I always hesitate to say what the best way to do anything is, but because there are many ways and some of them are equivalent, but the best way to mitigate the risk of cross-contamination if you're manufacturing multiple products in the same room is to choose equipment that mitigates that risk most, that does the best to mitigate that risk. Automated processes, again, are one of the best ways to do that. However, design of your clean room to not prevent, but to do the very best possible to prevent people from mucking it up. Our biggest risk is always people. If you design your clean room such that that it's much more difficult for people to muck it up, then you've mitigated that risk.
Okay, we'll wait just a couple more minutes for any additional questions to come in. Please use the Conferences.io app that's embedded in the WebEx, or scan the QR code with your mobile device.
I see a question about the typical cost per square foot. And I have to admit to you all that I do not know. It varies quite a lot. And that's why I don't know. It varies so much, and it depends on all of the decisions that we have made up until this point, all of the decisions that we've talked about, especially environmental quality, but not strictly limited to. So your typical cost is something that you can drive down based on your decisions. And you don't, if you have an average that you're looking at, you want to do your very best to beat that average. You want to come in under it. And you can do that if you make the proper decisions based on risk assessment.